Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Fields, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome to our final lecture of this semester, entitled, Why Do Young Men Oppose Gender Quotas? The Case of South Korea by Dr. Yesola Kweon. Before we get to the introduction, if you have found your way to this event, it is quite likely that our center does many other events that you might also be interested in. So I encourage you to visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu and to go to the bottom of the footer of our page and join our mailing list down where it says get involved. We send out a weekly mailing list every week during the semester that has a roundup of all of the news, events, and funding opportunities related to East Asia on campus. If you are an undergraduate student, we offer an undergraduate certificate in East Asian Studies. If you are a graduate student, we offer a PhD minor in East Asian Studies. And if you are a faculty member anywhere in Wisconsin, we offer various levels of affiliation with our center and funding opportunities. So please visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Yesola Kweon. Dr. Kweon is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Utah State University. Her research interests are international and comparative political economy, political behavior, and public policy with a focus on post-industrial economies, especially in East Asia. Within these broad fields, she studies how new forms of social and economic inequality associated with post-industrialization affect the behavior and attitudes of political actors and in turn reshape public policy. She is an author in the co-authored book, Democracy Under Siege, Parties, Voters, and Elections After the Great Recession, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Her research has been published in various journals such as Political Research Quarterly, Policy and Politics, and Electoral Studies. And we will hear from her today on why do young men oppose gender quotas, the case of South Korea. We will have time afterwards for Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function or type your questions directly into the chat. Dr. Kweon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction. And I want to first start by thanking the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin for inviting me for this talk. Let me first share my screen. Let's see. Can everyone see the screen? Great. Okay. So the presentation that I'll do today is based on my current research project that I'm doing with my colleague at Louisiana State University, Jung-Young Kim. And basically, we are interested in public attitudes towards gender equality policies in South Korea. And in particular, we're interested in young men's attitudes. Especially, we want to know how economic anxieties and insecurity that this group experiences would affect and shape their attitudes towards gender equality policies. So why do we look at young men? In the past years, I think there has been increasing attention to young men's attitudes, especially towards a woman and also feminism. And I think several studies provided both descriptive and analytical evidence that young men on average have higher level of hostility towards feminism and also towards various gender equality policies. If you're a Korean, you probably will be familiar with this series. There was a very famous series called 20대 남성, like men in their 20s, by this one of the major newspaper magazine in South Korea. And then they did a series of surveys of men and women in their 20s and 30s to measure their attitudes towards various gender-related policies and feminism. And this graph is from one of their survey data. And basically here, this graph shows the degree to which men and women in South Korea in their 20s and 30s agree with the following statement, that is, feminism pursues the equal status of men and women, right? And then the red line here is the responses by men in the 20s. And if you look at the x-axis, right, from the left to the right panels, right, it's strongly disagree, somewhat agree, and strongly agree. And if you look at this graph, men in the 20s have the highest rate of disagreement with the statement that feminism pursues the equal status of men and women, which means that more than 45%, including those who somewhat disagree with the statement, think that feminism does not pursue gender equality, right? And this is in a way quite outlier compared to other younger groups of the population. And this is another graph from the same survey data. And this time the statement is that feminism pursues woman's superiority. I don't know how to properly translate the term 여성우월주의 into English, but basically idea is that feminism pursues woman's superiority in the sense that they put woman's status over men's status, right? So to what extent do you agree with the statement? And again, men in their 20s, right, almost 60% of those men in 20s strongly agree that feminism pursues woman's superiority. And again, this answer is quite distinct from other groups of population and their responses. That kind of hostility towards feminism is also reflected in their attitudes towards policy, gender equality policies as well. This is another the responses, a table created based on responses from other survey data. And here we measure support for legislative gender quota among men, right? Men in South Korea. And again, men under 30 have highest rate of disagreement or opposition to legislative gender quota, right? So about 75% of men under 30s oppose legislative gender quotas, and that comes in contrast to older men, right? About 62% of men in the 50s and 65% of men in the 60s oppose legislative gender quota. So compared to this older group, men under 30s, right, they're almost 10% more likely to oppose legislative gender quota compared to men in the 50s and 60s. What's puzzling, also interesting, what's motivated our research project is that this kind of seemingly hostility, right, among the younger men, especially in their 20s, towards feminism or gender equality policies, are not driven by their gender norms. So this is another kind of descriptive evidence from different survey data. And here they try to measure Korean men's various kind of gender attitudes. And again, men in the 20s and 30s have highest kind of anti-feminist attitudes, right? Much higher than those in the 40s and 50s. But what's puzzling is that when it comes to gender norm, right, men in the 20s and 30s tend to have more liberal gender norms and more liberal understanding of gender roles in the society compared to those in the 40s and 50s. In other words, right, men in the 20s and 30s do not necessarily think that men and women are different in terms of their capacity or capability or their roles in society, right? It's actually those in the 40s and 50s who have more conservative and traditional view of gender roles. But men in the 20s and 30s are the ones who have more anti-feminist sentiment. So the puzzles here in our research project that we're trying to kind of examine is why this opposition to gender equality policies persists, particularly among young men, right, who have more liberal gender norms than older generation. Why is this question important to study? Well, as many studies in political sociology have demonstrated, political or social attitudes formed during impressionable years of the youth has long-term impact, right? So if some individual has awkward hostility, right, that was formed during younger years, right, it's likely to continue, right, throughout their political life in a very long term, right? Second, this kind of awkward hostility poses challenges to integrate relations and social stability. It increases tensions between the groups and also conflicts, right, between the groups. Another important reason why this is an important topic to study is because awkward hostility can create potential source of support for populist movements. Our project for this particular paper only focuses on South Korea, and we only look at gender equality attitudes. But if you look at other Western European countries or other advanced democracies like United States and in North America, then we realize that there has been the rise of radical right wings and populist movements and parties. And if you look at the essence of these populist agenda, right, and the core, not only they have very ethnocentric and anti-immigrant racist agenda, but also they have very many of them have very anti-feminist agendas. And if we look at who are the supporters of these populist movements, right, and the radical right-wing parties, both in Western Europe and in case of supporters for Trump in the United States, more than half of them are younger white males. Right. So although, again, like our study doesn't really look at radical right-wing parties or populist movements, but I think some of the implications that we see we draw from this paper can kind of have some important implications for broader political consequences of outward hostility. So then what explains public opposition to gender equality policy? Previous studies have predominantly emphasized gender norms and gender stereotypes or sexist attitudes as key determinants of public attitudes towards gender equality policies. So those who have more conservative views of gender roles in the society, those who believe that women should stay at home and men should be the one who should be dominating private and public sector, right? And people who have more sexist views of gender roles are more likely to oppose gender equality policies. By contrast, people who have more liberal gender roles, gender norms, they're more likely to support gender equality policies. Recent studies also emphasize trust in government as an important determinant of public attitude towards gender equality policies. People who have lower trust in government are less likely to support gender equality policies. But in this case, it's not necessarily people are opposing the idea of gender equality, but low trust in government, right, make them oppose any type of policy intervention by government to resolve social issues. However, all these factors cannot really still explain why the opposition to gender equality policy coexist with the declining traditional gender norms, particularly among younger people, right? There's still kind of incoherences, seemingly incoherent kind of attitudes among younger people. On the one hand, they're very liberal when it comes to gender norms, but they're still very hostile towards gender equality policies. So how do you make sense of that? So in our paper, we emphasize status threat, perceived status threat as the key explanatory variable to explain especially younger men's hostility or opposition to gender equality policies. So as more women's presence in the economy and politics grow over time, right, it will likely heighten status anxiety among men, which results in hostility towards gender equality policies. However, we argue that such effects of perceived status threat will be much more pronounced among those who are more vulnerable to dwindling status. And in this case, those are younger men. And the reason why younger men are more vulnerable to status threat is although they may have more liberal gender norms than older generation, they still grew up in an environment where they're socialized to be the dominant group, right? Still, they're more likely to, grow up looking at more male leaders and women leaders, right? more male professors than female professors, right, throughout their life, right, even though they may have more liberal gender norms, they still socialize to be the dominant group, right? That's still taken for granted in a lot of cases. And socially, there's a still public perception that financial and social status of men are closely related. So for men to have a social status, it's important socially for them to have financial security. But for this young man, achieving such social status that are expected by society is extremely hard in reality, because economically younger generations are facing much higher economic insecurity and precarity today, right? Types of economic well-being that were enjoyed by upper generation, their parents and grandparent generations, such as home ownership, right, or job security, are increasingly out of reach for younger generations. Right. So today, especially as the society enters into deindustrialization process, labor market is much more fragmented, right? And even the younger generation today are much better educated than upper generation. They are more likely to suffer from economic precarity and job insecurity, right? In fact, unemployment rate for the youth is extremely high in South Korea, and majority or more than half of college graduate for the first time when they get a job, they tend to get atypical, irregular jobs. And the fact that they're also younger, right? They're much earlier in their economic career, which means they're also economically less established, right? So all these socioeconomic environments in which these younger generations are situated, and social expectation about what men or men's status has to be, conflicting with the economic reality they're facing, makes this younger man to be more susceptible to status threat, perceived status threat imposed by women. We further argue that status threat effect will be independent of individuals' gender norms, right? Again, here we emphasize status threat is not solely caused by cultural norms, but by group-based economic anxiety that I explained earlier, right? So because the status threat is largely economically driven, right? We argue that it's possible that these individuals have liberal gender norms, right? On the one hand, but still oppose gender equality policies, not necessarily because they're opposing gender equality per se, but in fear of their negative impacts on socioeconomic status of men, when they already think that their state is under threat. So this is the descriptive graph based on the original data that we collected, right? And it shows the perceived economic insecurity by age group and educational attainment. What I want to emphasize here is that when we say group-based economic anxieties of young men, it's a cohort effect. In other words, we understand that there is individual variation among the younger group based on their own individual income or education levels, right? But nevertheless, right, there's a cohort effect because of the socioeconomic situation that they're situated. There is a kind of group level or cohort level economic anxiety that are higher than their upper generation, right? And that's kind of shown in this descriptive graph, right? So people with no college degree in general have higher level of economic insecurity, but both whether you have a college degree or not, a younger generation in general have higher level of perceived economic insecurity than older generation, right? Which means that even those who have kind of social cultural status, right, or labor skills, which are often measured by education level, right, are more likely to have higher economic insecurity for younger generation than older generations. Further, this is another descriptive statistics based on our own data. And then here we ask survey respondents, right, about their perception of young men and young women status today. And we ask whether they think that young men or young women's status has improved compared to the upper generation, right? And interestingly, when it comes to their perception of young women's status, right, across all groups, whether older or younger, men and women, they all view that women's status has improved. And there is no statistical difference across these groups in terms of their responses, right? But when it comes to young men status, right, they all agree that young men status has not improved as much as women's, right? But we see some statistically different, distinct response among younger men, right? That is, younger men are less likely to believe that young men's status has increased, right? And that kind of difference is compared to other groups is statistically significant. So going back to our argument, what we want to know, right? So far I just provided descriptive evidence, and now we have to actually analyze the data. And what we want to know here is that we want to know whether younger men are more susceptible to status threat, right? And whether exposure to status threat, right, will make those younger males to have lower level of support for gender equality policies, right? So to test those arguments, we conducted 2 survey experiments with the demographically representative sample in South Korea. In the first study, we only surveyed males because that was the main group that we were interested in. So we surveyed about 960 respondents. And then in the second study, we surveyed both males and females to make sure that this kind of behavior pattern is only detected among males, but not for females, right? And here we surveyed 1,000 respondents, 500 males and 500 females. And as I explained earlier, this is a survey experiment, which means that we have experimental component in our survey, right? That is, all the respondents who participate in our studies are randomly selected into one of the 2 groups. One is treatment group, right? The other is what we call control group, right? And basically the treatment group, right, will be exposed to the treatment vignette. So we provide a vignette text to the respondents who are randomly selected into the treatment group to invoke status threat, right? And then for the control group, right, they should not be exposed to any kind of treatment. So we provided, instead of treatment vignette, we provided placebo vignette, right? That has nothing to do with gender or economic anxiety, right? And I'll be happy to answer more about like the mechanism behind research design and the statistical analysis. But basically the core idea of this kind of experiment design is that when we design the surveys, right, except the treatment and control vignette, every other questions and order of those questions are exactly the same between the 2 groups, right? The only difference is whether respondents are exposed to treatment or not. And after giving this vignette, we'll ask series of questions about their attitudes towards gender equality policies, right? And then we'll later statistically analyze where there's any key difference between the treatment and control groups in terms of their average response to or attitude towards gender equality policies. And if you find any key difference, right, because every other things are controlled, right, and respondents are randomly assigned into those groups, we can conclude that the change or difference between the 2 groups is caused by the treatment, okay? So that's the core idea. And what we are interested in is not only whether treatment has an impact, right, in changing attitude towards gender equality policies, but whether such treatment effect will be stronger for younger males, right? So we divide the people into younger and older group, right? We use age 40 as a threshold, right? And then we also try different age cutoffs, right? And then our results are consistent across different age thresholds, right? And then this is the vignette text that we provided to the respondents in the treatment group, right? Again, the control group was not provided with the vignette, right? They were provided with the placebo, which is the text about how to take care of your health, right, during the flu season, right, which has nothing to do with gender and nothing to do with a status threat or economic anxiety. And for the treatment group only, this vignette text was provided, right? The idea of this vignette text is to kind of trigger status threat for males, right? And the text and the image are drawn from directly from existing newspaper article from 조선일보, right? And basically, it shows how the number of women employees in Korean conglomerates has rapidly increased at a faster rate than the number of male employees, right? And we use this as a treatment for status threat because especially when it comes to younger generations, right? Because job insecurity is extremely high, right? This kind of employment issue is very salient, right? And especially employment in conglomerate as understood as one of the best kind of scenario for employment, right? For younger generations, right? So we use this to trigger status threat, right? Especially among younger males, right? And then later I'm going to show how, the question is whether this actually trigger intended treatment effect or not, right? Later, I'm going to show that it actually triggers such status threat perception among younger males. So the question is whether people who are exposed to this kind of treatment vignette have different kind of behavior when it comes to their attitude towards gender equality policies than those who are in the control group, right? And first, we're gonna examine attitude towards legislative gender quota, right? And basically, this graph is based on our statistical analysis, and it shows what we call marginal effect in treatment effect. But we don't have to basically go into detail. But what this graph shows is that if you look at the left and middle panels, those are the panels that shows the effect of treatment on old and young males for their attitude towards gender equality policies. And what this basically shows that status threat treatment lowers younger people's support for legislative gender quotas, but it has no impact on older men, right? And when you look at the right panel, that's for females, right? For females, both for older and younger females, status threat treatment has no impact, right? In other words, only younger males, when they're exposed to this status threat treatment, we see reduced support for gender equality policies, and we see little impact of the treatment on other groups of population. And then again, one could wonder whether this, finding would apply to other areas of gender equality policies beyond political realm, right? So we examine attitudes towards equal pay and corporate quotas to see whether that also affects attitude towards gender equality policies in private sector. And again, we don't have to care too much about all the numbers, but basically what this number in orange color shows is that younger males in the treatment group are less likely to support equal pay and corporate quotas compared to those in the control group or older males, while for females, both treatment and age has no impact, right? Which is consistent with our finding about the gender quotas. Then one could stop here and ask why, but still, why does, do these people oppose gender quotas? The downside of this statistical analysis is it's really hard to kind of find the mechanism, right? And another question one could ask is that, okay, fine, we see this statistical difference between treatment and control group, especially when it comes to younger men, right? But how do we know the vignette text that I just showed actually had intended effect, posing the status threat among the younger males, right? So to tap on these issues, we additionally included open-ended questions in our surveys in both studies. In the first study, we asked those people who oppose gender quotas, asked to explain why they're opposing this policy. And very interestingly, older men and younger men provided very different reasonings for their opposition to gender quotas. For older men, basically the key reason why they oppose gender quotas are related to gender norms, right? They have conservative gender norms, such as the pool of women candidate is limited, right? Women and men have different qualifications. Women's innate qualities are inappropriate for political leadership. So those are some all related to kind of their perception of gender stereotypes, right? And then gender norms. By contrast, when it comes to young men and we ask why they oppose gender quotas, right? Nobody referred to gender norms, right? most of the time they refer to status, concerns about their status, right? The term that came up most frequently in their responses was 역차별, which is reverse discrimination, right? So they worry that quota will cause reverse discrimination against men. They really worry that it's gonna weaken their position in the society. They feel they're punished, right? And they feel it's unnecessary, right? When they think that gender equality is not an issue necessarily anymore, right? So it's mostly about this concerns about status, and there's no mention, no reference to gender norms. Not only that, this kind of concern about the status was stronger among young men in the treatment group, which kind of confirms that the treatment being actually had intended effects. Further, in the second study, we asked respondents to explain in detail like what the effect of gender quota would be on men and women's status. Right? So they have to like write what their belief of the quota effects would be. And basically what it shows is that male respondents, especially young men, are much more likely to believe that quota will have a negative impact on men's status. And such belief is stronger again among men in the treatment group, right? So then, so far we've established that young men are more susceptible to status threat, right? And then exposure to status threat will likely to reduce their support for gender equality policies. But again, the previous studies, one of the key kind of alternative explanation or competing hypothesis in this case would be the gender norms, right? Because some studies argue that exposure to status threat will change people's gender norm, right? Making them to embrace more conservative gender norm, right? And then that's why they have reduced support for gender equality policies. So we have to resolve this part, right? To make sure that our argument, to support our argument that support or opposition to gender equality policies are independent of gender norms, right? So then we did the additional analysis, right? And here basically we show that younger people in general not only have more liberal gender norms, but exposure to treatment, right? Status treatment has no impact on their gender norm, which means that young men, right, have liberal gender norms, and the status threat treatment does not change or does not make them to embrace more conservative gender norms, right? Which means that our findings about exposure to status threat kind of causes them to have reduced level of gender equality policies are not running through gender norms, right? As many previous study would predict. So what are the implications of our research then? Well, first of all, our research shows that liberal gender norms are not sufficient to explain attitudes for gender or support for gender equality policies, right? Existing studies have emphasized gender norms and struct type as the key determinant to explain public attitude towards gender equality policies. But what our research shows is that that's not enough, right? Especially when it comes to young men, right? They may have liberal gender norms. They may believe, right, that men and women are equal in terms of their capacity, right, and their roles in society. Yet they still oppose gender equality policies. So there should be some other explanation, right, to understand their behavior. Second, we also show that stated anxiety translates into skepticism towards policy measures meant to ensure equality and diversity in political systems, right? So again, what it means is that economic anxiety or insecurity that people experience have very important political implications and implications for democratic representations, right? Often quotas are understood as kind of very effective short-term measure to expand representation of marginalized groups, right? But when there's a strong opposition from the public, and when that, right, and then that opposition is driven by, can be driven by economic anxiety of that group, right? Lastly, we also show that young men are more susceptible to status anxiety. And what it shows is that young men today, or younger generation in general, right, have very high economic precarity and insecurity. And I don't think that's a specific issue unique to South Korea, right? we see the similar trend in other countries again. Even when we just think about United States, right? The younger generation today, right, in terms of economic well-being, right, or their economic prospect test, like they're the first generation in the post-war history whose economic well-being will not be better off than their upper generation, right? And we see this trend in many other advanced industrial democracies, right? What does it mean for their political behavior, right? What does it mean for democratic representation, right? Again, our paper only focuses on South Korean gender attitudes, but I think there's a lot of room for research, right, to understand really the political implication and social implication of economic anxiety that a lot of younger generation experience today. So that was the presentation that I prepared today, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Yesola, for a really interesting presentation on an important topic. For those in the audience, feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A function or in the chat. But I have a couple of questions maybe to get us started. Full disclaimer, I'm a historian, and so often when I see numbers and sociological analysis, it can be a little bit intimidating, but I trust that you've done all your research correctly, and it's a really impressive body of research. I'm wondering, in a comparative sense, how do these young men compare? Is there any comparative data coming from China and coming from Japan that could be a benchmark, or is there data coming really maybe from anywhere else that you could make some sort of claim about this effect is more extreme in South Korea or less extreme than it is in other places, the status threat?
That's actually a very good question, and this is exactly a topic that I study in other country cases too. And I think that in terms of economic insecurity that South Korean younger generations have, I would say that I wouldn't say it's extreme per se, but I think compared to many other so-called advanced industrial economies, right, although we do see very similar trend, right, across countries, I think that the situation that younger generation faced in South Korea is a little bit more harder, right? But even in our neighboring country like Japan, we see a very similar trend, and they just had election, right, general election on October 31st in Japan, right, and not surprisingly, LDP won, right, again very easily, right. And if you look at who are the supporters of LDP, right, younger generation, right, especially males, had a very high level of support for LDP. So of course, like LDP's largest electoral base is on the rural area and older people, right? But also you can see that when we compare the voting behavior between younger males and women, we see very huge, like kind of large gender gap there. Even the majority of people are supporting LDP, right? And there are many reasons why, but one of the reasons is that these are the people who kind of are, especially those who were born in 1990s and after, right? They're the generation who never experienced economic growth, right, in Japan, right? It's after this lost decades that they were born, and they've only experienced economic deflation, right? So people, that kind of economic experience make people very conservative, right? Whether that will be expressed in agro-postality, I mean, I think that's exactly the topic that I'm going to study for the next project. But I think there is a possibility. And then I think that, we don't really see populist parties necessarily in like kind of radical right-wing types of parties in Western Europe and East Asia yet. But I think there's a room for that, like if this kind of sentiment continues.
Very, very interesting. Another follow-up question to this, and you were talking about young men in Korea actually having more liberal ideas of gender norms, and so that's not an explanation of this. Having lived in Korea for a little while and read a number of studies about especially domestic work and how domestic chores are shared disproportionately in South Korea by women. They're disproportionate everywhere, but in South Korea, they're especially disproportionate. Is that true? Are young men more willing to do domestic work in South Korea than their older counterparts? Or has this more liberal gender norm not really filtered into that aspect of domestic relations?
That's actually a very good question. I think it's both. I think compared to older generation, I think younger generation, younger men do, I wouldn't say like equal share of housework, right? But do a bit more share of like housework compared to older generation. And there's kind of public, like, how to say, the increasing public discussion, right, about this issue, right? And then kind of like public shaming of people who wouldn't explicitly, who would explicitly reject such burden or role, right? But at the same time, like when we look at like, when we actually survey people on their perception of gender norms, right? It's younger, given that younger men are more likely to be liberal, right? And you would expect that they will actually have almost equal share of the housework, but that's not really the pattern we see either, right?
So could it be possible that there are more traditional gender norms perhaps hiding somewhere that need to be exposed and that they could be part of this? Or do you feel confident that the status threat and the economic anxieties are really the driving factor behind the phenomena that you're showing us?
I think that's a very good question. And I think the problem with the survey is that it's, to what extent you're actually measuring, right, their actual like inner side, right, as opposed to like, they're answering politically correct way, right? And there's many ways, although not perfect, to resolve that issue. And that's what we try to do in surveys. So for instance, instead of asking very explicitly, right, why, like whether they view that women and men are different, right? There's a kind of indirect way to tap that and make them to be more nuanced instead of like making them to make binary choices, right? That's one way. Another way is that we also included kind of open-ended questions after asking their attitude to a gender equality policy, asking why, if they're opposed, after asking gender norm question, asking why, if they have conservative gender norm, like why they are supporting such gender norm, so that by providing opportunity for these people to justify themselves, right? Many studies shows that kind of reduce social disability bias too. So we did those kind of how do you say, measures in survey to make sure that this is not just like politically correct answers, and we do still find some liberal attitudes of men. In relation to your question, why we then still see some, how do you say, masculine or misogynistic behavior among men, I think there are many reasons. And of course, like sexism that this survey didn't capture is definitely one of them. And there are many different types of sexism too, right? And we're explicitly capturing, we're more interested in their gender attitude towards social, like gender roles in society. We're not really looking at how, to what extent, these men are commodifying women's body, for instance, which is another dimension of sexism. And I'm sure that's like very strong even among younger men, and we're not really capturing that because it's not really the topic that we're interested in, right? But I think there are also many other social and institutional reasons why we see this unequal divide of the domestic work between men and women, right? So for instance, right, the maternal leave is more widely used than paternal leave, partially because of the cultural environment, right, which makes them men to have like much less burden of domestic work, right? So I think I'm just like providing very long-winded answer, but what I'm trying to say is that like I'm not denying that like there might be some sexism embedded that our survey couldn't capture, right? But even when we put that aside and accept that people may have very equal view of the gender norms, right, among men, we still can see some gendered behavior, partially not necessarily because of their perception of gender roles, but also because of the social culture and institutional environment that we're situated.
Thank you very much. And that, I don't think that was a long-winded answer at all. I think that was an excellent answer. We have a question here from Rachel So in the Q&A, and she says, "Thank you. This was hugely helpful for my understanding of the topic. Ilbe Storehouse has come into my line of sight during my own research. Did you come across this in your research? And if so, do you think that an anti-feminist discourse on Ilbe has factored into the results? I have read that the most of Ilbe's user base is male, and that 35% of the user base is between 21 and 25 years old." So maybe, first of all, you can explain to us what Ilbe Storehouse is. I'm not sure that I know what it is. And then maybe you can answer Rachel's question.
Yeah, so Yesola Storehouse is basically an online platform or online website where largely, like predominantly used by very radical right-wing or conservative males, right? A lot of these male users, as Rachel mentions, are young, right, in their 20s, early 20s or in 30s. For my research, I didn't necessarily look at that. I feel like that's totally different, but I feel like that's kind of different groups of males for different projects, partially because for this project that I presented today, what I really want to see is a general young men's behavior, right? There has been a lot of attention to gender conflict and men, like young men's behavior in much more radical sense, right? Since 2016, when there's a Gangnam murder case of women, right, that ignited this like series of feminist movements, right? It was more about like why men are killing women, why there's a lot more sexual violence in women. And I feel like that's very important discourse we need to have on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's not just extreme cases we need to care about. It's everyday kind of, how do you say, like behavior and attitudes, right, that are very kind of prevalent among what we call normal, ordinary young men, right? So it's not like, so that's what I want to kind of understand. It's not just, especially when it comes to policy decisions, right? When parties listen to voters, it's not just like this radical small groups that they're going to listen to, but it's like broader voice. And I just want to kind of bring up and to people's attention that, you know, we have to think about this like broader, you know, group of younger men, not just people who commit kind of violent crimes. So I didn't really kind of looked at Ilbe kind of Storehouse, and sometimes they're called incels, I guess, in English, right? And their behavior, right? But definitely, I think that's part of this trend, right? In much more extreme dynamic. And I'll be very interested in studying their behavior in the future as well. And in fact, in the University of Wisconsin-Madison Political Science Department, there is a political scientist who studied incels, but not in the context of South Korea, but in the context of the United States and Europe, right? So I think that's a very interesting topic. And the topic, again, that's not unique to Korea.
Many avenues for future research for you and other scholars, to be sure. Rachel also asked when the paper will be published, or when will it be available, or is it already available?
It's under review. It's we just revised and submitted the paper, so it's under, like, it's in the second round of review right now. So it's really up to the editor and the reviewers.
Okay. Well, please let us know when it is published, and we'll be happy to promote it. We have another question here from James Turnbull, who asks, "Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the impact of Korea's skewed sex ratio in the 1990s. Although it has since been solved, at one point in the 1990s, there were 116 boys for 100 girls, meaning that there was a huge cohort of 20 to 30 something men in Korea now who can't find female partners and who may unfairly resent women for that. Do you think this is in any way relevant to the anti-feminist attitudes you encountered in your survey?" And I have to admit that came to me, that factor came to me as I was listening to your talk, but I did a quick Google search and saw that the sex ratio is now very, very, I mean, it's, I think 101 to 100. I mean, it's very close.
It's very low, yeah.
But I did not realize it was that bad in the 1990s. Thank you, James, for asking that question. What are your thoughts on that?
I think when it comes, I think that's a very good point. Definitely, sex ratio, very unbalanced sex ratio was a huge problem. But I think the way that's manifested in Korea is not necessarily through anti-feminist sentiment. I think that's the generation who are in their 40s or 50s or upper generation today, right? And I think the issue that we see from that generation is that because of unbalanced sex ratio, we see this, international brides problem, right? And I think that's kind of more issue that's more corresponding to sex ratio. And that generation, for younger generation who were born in 90s and afterwards, I think it's not necessarily sex ratio that's driving this trend per se, right? But it's just a resentment, partially coming from economic anxiety that they have, and partially this kind of still existing social expectation about the men's status, right? And then kind of the reality in which they're situated with such, expected social status is increasingly hard to achieve.
Yesola, this is completely off the topic of your presentation, but I'm just so curious. Do you know, or can you comment on how the ROK was able to close such a massive sex ratio discrepancy, if James is correct, in a relatively short amount of time, about 20 years?
Yeah, that's beyond my expertise. I don't think I can provide a proper answer to that, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, and we have another question from Juhee Jung. Thank you for an interesting presentation. The issue has been an ongoing issue in South Korea, and even the word feminism includes aggressive misogyny meaning among young South Korean men as well. This has also led to a new stage for the Conservative Party with lots of support from young Korean men. So my question is, do you also consider the polarization of politics in South Korea as also triggering the conflict?
Absolutely. I think that's part of the problem. And I think when it comes to polarization politics in South Korea, on the one hand, existing polarization, intensifies the kind of divide, right, based on gender, right? I don't want to say conflict because I know some people think that that's very politicized term, especially when it comes to gender relations in South Korea. But because especially Conservative Party, they know that they have more support, increasing support from younger men, and then progressive parties or even minor parties like Justice Party, right, have a broader support base based on the younger females, right? So for them to kind of really establish that electoral base, I think they're polarizing, they're even politicizing gender issue. And you can definitely see in the behavior of, for instance, the leader of the Conservative, the main opposition party today, Lee Jun-seok, right? On the other hand, I think the existing gender divide also feeds this polarization. So there's this kind of feedback effect, right? And absolutely, as Juhee mentioned, feminism, somehow the term in Korea is politicized, and it's no longer, it's about the perception or attitude about towards the gender equality, but it became kind of the term is now associated with the woman's superiority, right? I just showed in the graph, right? So even those people who agree that gender equality, should be achieved in society, right? Now, they cannot call themselves openly as feminists.
Very, very interesting. It's my understanding that in the most recent elections in 2020, it was a fairly large number of female legislators that were elected, perhaps even the largest in history. Is that
19%? Yes.
And do you think that maybe what accounts for that when you're seeing all of this rise in all this opposition to gender equality policies and even to a legislative quota, and yet this coincides with perhaps the largest legislative cohort of women elected? Is there perhaps a feminist backlash to the anti-feminist movement that we see among men in their 20s, or what are the other possible explanations?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, partially when we think about how much increase we see, I mean, it's only 2% increase, right? It used to be 17%, now it's 19%. So it's not dramatic increase per se. And ever since Korea adopted gender quota, mandated gender quota in PR tier since 2004, the gender, the women's ratio of women in the Congress has been consistently steadily increased, right? From 5% to 19%, right? Within the 15 years or more. So I don't think it's necessarily like dramatic change per se in 2020 election, although it is the highest share of women. Nevertheless, I do believe that I think, since 2016, right, we had this series of feminist movements, and it's very, it built very important momentum for female voters in Korea, right? That is, I think a lot of females realize that, they need to organize, and then they have a power when they are organized, right? And it was also the first election that we had a women's party in the country, right? So definitely gender now is a very salient issue in Korea, and it will be a very salient issue in the next presidential election too. And that's, I think, part of the reason that for some women, they see that, we need some changes, and for that changes to happen, we need more women in politics.
All right. Well, we are out of time here today, but Dr. Kweon, thank you so much for joining us today and for giving a really, really great lecture. Thank you for all of you in the audience who joined us. It's my understanding that this will be posted later on our YouTube channel, where you can also go and see probably now 30 to 40 other events that we have done on all sorts of topics related to Korea, China, and Japan, and also their connections with the United States and other societies. So thank you so much, Dr. Kweon. Thank you to you. Please visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu to learn about our events in the future and to join our mailing list. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, David, for moderating. Thanks everyone for attending. Bye.